Chapter 13 of Hardcase by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Chapter 13. Will Usher walked out from behind the horses, smiling broadly. He had no fear of being killed now, for Dave Coyle's word, to lawman or outlaw, was never broken. He walked over to Dave, his handsome face smiling. Somewhere in the turmoil he had lost his hat, but he was still wearing his dusty frock coat and his soiled gloves.
"Well, well, Davy," he said wryly. "I thought I had a place here that was coil-proof."
"You'll never have one, Will," Dave said. "When I get through with this business, I'm going to spend a little time on you."
They looked at each other a moment, Will Usher's face troubled, his eyes angry. He looked like a gambler who had tried to fill a bobtail straight and was both surprised and angry that he hadn't. Dave Coyle looked disappointed too, and grim. McPhee, now that the shooting was over, tramped out of the mill shed, Sholto behind him. Dave looked at McPhee and, remembering that McPhee, instead of warning him of the man inside the shack waiting for him, had stood there with his hands in the air, said sardonically,
"I don't know what I'd do without a fighting partner like you, McPhee."
McPhee's face was a brick red. "I'm not a gunfighting man," he said.
"Why mention gunfighting?"
Dave sneered.
"Here."
He handed McPhee his gun.
"If he says boo, just hold tight and maybe it won't fall out of your hand."
Dave went back into the mill shed. The man behind the door had shot his partner, and they were both lying dead across the sill. Dave went on through the office to a smaller one and found what he was looking for. The watchman had been bound and gagged and was lying on the floor. Dave untied him. Afterward, he went out to the horses. Usher and McPhee mounted first, and Dave swung up alongside of Sholto's horse.
"I've got your wife safe," Dave said to Sholto. "You don't have to go back to Wallace now. We're showing you to Beale so he'll free McPhee, and then you can ride out."
Sholto's eyes lighted up with a faint hope, and he said,
"Thanks."
"You let me get past you that night at the line camp. I pay back my debts."
They rode out of the canyon. Will Usher called down his guard, who was forted up on the canyon slope, and Dave disarmed him and gave him the extra horse. At the mouth of the canyon, Will Usher said,
"I'll leave you here, Davy boy,"
and grinned at him. Dave shifted in his saddle and regarded Usher with speculation in his eyes.
"Aim to hightail it, Will?"
Usher laughed.
"I don't reckon. You know why, Davy? Because I think they'll nail your hind to the wall before you're through here. I aim to help 'em."
Dave nodded agreeably.
"Stick around. It'll save me trouble hunting you."
Usher laughed, waved agreeably, and headed down the road toward Wagon Mound. Dave and McPhee and Sholto cut through the timber, rounding the base of the Corazon, and headed for Yellow Jacket. It was a long ride and a hard one, and Dave hurried. He wanted more than anything else at this moment to get McPhee off his hands. Once that was done, once it was proved to Carol that he was willing to help her father, he would be free to work on what was important. Sholto, after all, was a minor matter, a nuisance, a byproduct of the court fight. What was important was the identity of the man behind Tate Wallace. Darkness caught them far out on the flats west of Yellow Jacket. A chill night wind riding the earth bit into them and gave its warning of winter soon to come. It seemed to Dave, looking over at Sholto and McPhee with their shoulders hunched against the cold, that all of them would be glad to part company. McPhee was sulky, not even cheered by the prospect of his freedom. Sholto was more quiet than any man Dave had seen. He seemed to be considering something, keeping his own counsel. The three of them were like strangers, not even wanting to speak to each other. When they were finally in sight of the lights of Yellow Jacket, Dave said grimly,
"Well, we'll part company pretty quick. What do you aim to do then, McPhee?"
"Take up the fight where you interrupted it," McPhee said bitterly. "That is, if Sholto goes back to Wallace and intends to swear he was witness to the deed." Dave said to Sholto,
"Will you?"
"I don't know," Sholto said. "I gotta think."
They picked up the road south of town, and now the lights of the town were distinct up ahead. They passed the first houses on the outskirts of town, and Dave peered through the darkness at Sholto. Would he show himself to Bill, then vanish? Or would he hunt up Wallace again? Dave didn't know and didn't care, but he did know that if he were in McPhee's boots, he would be talking, pleading, threatening, or buying him off. Instead, McPhee was sulkily watching Sholto. They passed into the business section now, and ahead were the lights of the saloons. The sheriff's office was lighted also, Dave saw. When he came to the middle block of the town, where old Beatty's store threw out its light into the street, he reined up.
"This is as far as I go," he murmured. "I'll wait and see if they free you, McPhee."
He looked at the tie rail in front of Tim King's Keno parlor. It was jammed with horses. Through the big front window, he could see a section of the bar, and there, back to the window, was Tate Wallace. Dave looked at Sholto. Sholto had seen Wallace too, and his face was a little pale. McPhee said impatiently, "Let's go, Sholto." Sholto put his horse in motion and rode beside McPhee up the street. He was watching Wallace through the saloon window. They were just angling across the street to the sheriff's office when Sholto reined up. "I'm not going in, McPhee," he said stubbornly. "Not going?" McPhee's voice died, then he said, "But damn it, man, you've got to. I'll hang for your murder if you don't." "No," said Sholto shortly. "It's either you or me that will hang. Might as well be you." "What do you mean, you—" "I mean, Wallace is in town now," Sholto said swiftly. "He blackmailed me into witnessing that deed. He was holding my wife a prisoner there at the Three Rivers to make sure I didn't run out on him. But Coyle has got my wife hid. Wallace ain't got anything to make me come back, so he'll tell." "Tell what?" "That he saw me kill a man," Sholto said evenly. "I killed him, all right. I was drunk and mad, and I shot him. And they can hang me for it. And Wallace has told Bill." "How do you know?" "He didn't come after me when Usher had me, did he? No. He knows now that if he can't hold Lily anymore, I'll light a shuck the first chance I get. So he'll tell Bill. He told him. He's here, and I'll stand trial." He pulled his horse around. "Sorry, McPhee, but I got my own hide to think of." "Wait a minute," McPhee ordered. Clumsily then, he pulled out a gun and leveled it at Sholto. "I'm not hanging for any man, not even—" Crash! A 6-gun bellowed from somewhere, and Sholto was driven over the saddle horn and fell into the road on his face, his shirt and back welling crimson blood. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Hardcase by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. On the heels of the report, McPhee's horse began to pitch. In the terror, it arched its back and started to buck in a circle. Men began to pour out of King's Keno parlor. Above the tumult, Dave yelled, "Run for it, McPhee!" Then someone opened up with a 6-gun from the opposite sidewalk, someone who had recognized Dave's voice. Another shot hammered out. Dave yanked his horse around, leaned over its neck, and roweled him savagely, heading out of town. What had happened? Somebody planted up on the roof of Beatty's store had shot Sholto. Dave had seen the gun flash, and there was McPhee, a gun in his hand, threatening Sholto, who seemed as if he was aiming to ride off. McPhee was in for it now, and all Dave could do was run to keep from getting the same thing. Already he heard horses pounding down the road behind him. Back in town, Ernie C. and Sheriff Beale had been the first out the door of the sheriff's office. Ernie took the scene in at a glance as he vaulted the tie rail. McPhee's terrified horse went into a savage sunfish, and McPhee flew out of the saddle. He landed on his shoulder, and Ernie dived on top of him. He wrestled the gun out of his hand, and when he stood up, Beale was leaning over Sholto. Men were running toward them from the saloons, and still others were swinging into the saddle and heading out of town. Beale looked up from Sholto and said to Ernie, "He's dead." Slowly, McPhee hauled himself to his feet, looking dazed. Beale said wickedly, "That hangs you, McPhee. Hangs you higher than any kite ever flown." "But I didn't shoot him," McPhee cried. Beale said, "Give me that gun you took from him, Ernie." Ernie gave it to him, and Beale spun the cylinder. There was one cartridge shot. Beale smelled the barrel and said evenly, "One empty, and there's a powder smell. How about that, McPhee?" There was a murmuring of men surrounding them, and McPhee looked helplessly at them. "But I didn't do it, I tell you. I only had a gun in my hand. He wouldn't come in."
"By God, we ought to string him up,"
one man in the crowd said. Ernie said to McPhee,
"If you're smart, you'll keep your mouth shut."
"Get him inside,"
Bill ordered. Ernie, his hand on McPhee's arm, broke the crowd and took McPhee into the sheriff's office, through it, and into the cell block in the cell. Beale, with a half-dozen select citizens, followed. McPhee looked dazed. It had all happened too fast. Beale, from the other side of the door, said, "What happened?" "I was bringing Sholto in here to prove to you I never killed him. Me and Dave Coyle, that is. Dave stayed down street and left me to bring him in. Sholto balked just in front of the office. I pulled a gun on him and told him to come along. Then come a shot and my horse started to pitch. That's all I know." Bill said sarcastically, "Beautiful. A good little Injun spirit aimed the gun and pulled the trigger, I suppose." "But I didn't kill him." "Who did? Dave Coyle? Sholto's back was to both of you. Beale said slyly. McPhee stared at him, his hard dislike for Dave forming into suspicion and then into certainty. He hadn't shot Sholto himself. There was nobody else on the street except Dave. The shot had come from somewhere down there. Dave had given him that gun, taken from a dead guard at the mine. Dave hated him and said so. Suddenly it came to him clear as crystal. Before, when they were in jail, Dave was accused of killing Sholto at McPhee's orders. But by getting Sholto safe and planting him with McPhee in front of the sheriff's office, and then shooting him, the blame for Sholto's murder would be settled for once and all, on McPhee's head. It was that easy, that cynical, that slick. McPhee's eyes focused on Beale, and he was not even clever enough to dissimulate.
"Yes," he balked. "Coyle shot him. He was the only one who would shoot him,"
Ernie said in angry and withering disgust.
"How I'd love you for a partner, McPhee."
McPhee was excited now. The truth had fully dawned on him, and he set out to spread it with a bullheaded passion.
"But I tell you, Coyle's framing me. He killed Sholto. He put Sholto up to stall in at the last minute, so's I draw a gun. I tell you, Coyle did it."
Ernie C. was really angry. He hated Dave Coyle with a hatred that was all-consuming, but he hated a disloyal man more. But above and beyond that, he was puzzled. This didn't make sense. Why would McPhee bring Sholto, on whose recognition he would go free, up to the very doorstep of the sheriff's office and then shoot him? The answer was he wouldn't. No sane man would. And the story of Dave Coyle shooting him was too far-fetched to be worth any consideration. McPhee had jumped at Beale's bait like the simple fool he was. But that left the question unanswered. Who shot Sholto? Beale was saying heatedly,
"If you ask me, McPhee, it was something you and that damn Helion planted beforehand. That's his idea of fun, and yours too, I reckon. If your horse hadn't pitched, you'd be riding off with Coyle now and laughing at what you'd done. Damn you," he added with savage anger. "You ain't even fit to stretch a rope."
Bill turned and then said to the others,
"Give me 10 men that'll make good deputies to guard him. I'm going to sleep them right here in the cell block. This time he won't get away."
He named 4 men to watch McPhee, then tramped out into the office, Ernie behind him. Bill yanked down a rifle from the wall rack, and then he looked at Ernie, anger and bewilderment in his face.
"What's this country coming to?" he asked seriously. "When that can happen, things is pretty bad."
Ernie said quietly,
"McPhee didn't shoot Sholto."
Bill's movement in taking the gun down was arrested. He was immobile a second. Then he said,
"You think Coyle did?"
"I don't think either of them did,"
Ernie said bluntly. Bill just stared at him in voiceless amazement.
"Harv, when I took that gun from McPhee, it was cold. It hadn't been shot."
"It was warm when you give it to me," Bill countered angrily.
"I held it by the barrel."
They glared at each other, and Bill said,
"You saying Coyle shot him?"
"No."
"And McPhee didn't either?"
"McPhee didn't shoot him, and Coyle didn't either,"
Ernie said stubbornly. Beale's mouth formed a grim line. He went over to the desk and laid the gun on it and put his hands on his hips.
"Ernie,"
he began quietly,
"it ain't no secret to me that you're a bull-headed, open-handed gent. But by God, when you try to tell me that a man dies of spontaneous combustion or something, you're also crazy as hell. You're crazier than hell."
He ran a hand through his hair and made a hopeless, angry gesture.
"God almighty, I think I'm going crazy myself."
One of McPhee's guards opened the corridor door and said, "McPhee said if you want to catch Coyle, go out to his place, the Bib M. He's sure Coyle will head there." Bill said crisply,
"Get going, Ernie. He'll have shut that gang by now in the dark. Pick him up and ride hell for leather for the Bib M."
Ernie tramped out, his face sullen and angry and baffled. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Hard Case by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Chapter 15. It was not hard to shake the posse. Dave cut off to the west once he was out of town, rode a quarter of a mile, cut back toward the town, and rode completely around it, coming up so close to the rear of the posse he could hear them arguing. They were on the ground lighting matches, trying to pick his tracks out of a tangle of others on the flats. Dave made a wide circle of them then and headed west. He didn't know why he was going this way, except that it led to the Corazon and safety. All this had stunned him, and for a moment he reined up, wondering if he should go back to town and hunt down the bushwhacker. But how could he? All he had had to do was climb down off Beatty's roof and mingle with the crowd. He urged his horse on and tried to think. Whoever shot Sholto knew that Sholto was being brought in. The only people who knew that were Will Usher, who could have guessed it, and Carol, who was told it in McPhee's note to her. Whom had Carol told? Until he knew he was at sea, just guessing. Will Usher might have killed Sholto, but what would he gain? Nothing. No money, no prestige, no pardon, nothing. The secret lay with the note to Carol, and whom she had told. Dave put the spurs to his horse then, realizing that McPhee would depend on him to learn this from Carol. He didn't know how long it would take Sheriff Beale to worm this from McPhee and head for the Bib M himself, but he guessed it wouldn't take long. It was a long ride, and he was dog-tired. His horse was tired too, but this was one time he couldn't spare the leather. He took off across country, taking his direction from the high cold stars. He had never felt lonelier, more puzzled, more defeated in his life, and more stubborn. For it was plain to him that this would be a fight to the finish now. Whoever risked that shot was willing to risk his life to win. And what puzzled him more than all else was that Wallace, the man who would be most interested in seeing McPhee saddled with a murder, was visible through the window of King's Keno parlor when the shooting occurred. It didn't make sense, but it did make an airtight, sealed, and delivered frame-up for Bruce McPhee. The Bib M was dark when he rode into the valley before it, and he drew a deep breath of relief. He rode into the yard, was about to tie his horse at the tie rail, and then thought better of it. He led the horse around to the woodshed and back and tied it there, then came around to the front door and knocked and tugged at the bell rope. A lamp was lighted upstairs, and he heard soft footsteps on the gallery above him.
"Who is it?" Carol asked softly.
"Me."
"Dave Coyle, what do you want?"
There was an undercurrent of hostility and anxiety in her voice already. Dave said, "Come down here." Carol went inside and came downstairs and opened the door. She faced him in a gray wrapper bound about her, and her hair was braided in 2 long ropes down her back. Her face was soft and pink, sleep still in it. She said immediately,
"Where's Dad?"
"In jail." Carol took that without a word, but she was hating him when she looked at him.
"And you're free," she said angrily. "I guess I should have expected that. How'd they catch him?"
Dave told her about the happenings in town. When he told her of Sholto, a look of pain supplanted the anger in her face, but she said nothing. When he was finished, he waited for her to ask questions, but she only said softly,
"Poor Lily."
"Your dad never killed him," Dave said. "He didn't shoot." Carol said scathingly,
"Do you think I have to be told that? What's more to the point is that did you kill him?"
Dave said patiently, "No."
"Then I guess that's all I want to know about it," Carol said bitterly. "I'm glad you've come. I have a proposition to make to you."
Dave didn't say anything, only watched her, the lamplight making his cheekbones seem flat and high, his eyes deep.
"I'll sign over half my inheritance to you if you'll leave the country," Carol said warily. "Once upon a time, before you came here, we only had a simple court fight to win. Now Dad has to face a murder trial."
She made a grimace of disgust.
"Oh, can't you see we don't want you, that you can't help us, that we hate you? Leave us alone. Why do we have to suffer, you two? On account of a foolish girl's mistake in writing you?"
2 spots of color burned deeply in Dave's cheekbones. She had a right to say that, only he hated her for saying it. At that moment he hated the whole McPhee family, and only his stubbornness kept him from walking out into the night. He put a hand flat on the hallway wall, leaned on it, cuffed his Stetson back off his black hair, and his eyes were tiny pinpoints of anger. He said with savage anger, "Listen, I don't want anything out of you, McPhees. Not even a kind word. Did you ever hear me say I'd help you?"
"Why, no,"
Carol said truthfully. "I kidnapped Sholto because I saw a chance to make a piece of money, not to help you. I got your dad out of jail because Beale figured wrong and thought we'd throw it in with each other. All I got out of it was a cussing out from your dad and a cussing out from you. I expect that, I reckon. You're trash, the lot of you." Carol winced under the slow, measured whiplash of his words, but she kept looking at him. "Another thing," Dave went on, his spare quiet words coming in a level monotone. "I'd hate to have you think I ever done anything for you. I've known honky-tonk girls I'd sooner help than you. I'd sooner help Lily Sholto than you, and I saw her just once in my life. So don't get any wrong ideas about me."
"I never had,"
Carol said with quiet contempt.
"You're utterly selfish. A cheap little killer."
"That's right," Dave said levelly. "So don't expect me to make a hero out of myself just 'cause you spoke to me once. I want you to get this through your thick McPhee skull. I'm in this because somebody is trying to make a sucker out of me, not to help you." Carol said presently,
I don't understand that.
That's 'cause you've got McPhee blood in you, Dave jibed. The McPhees don't understand anything. But I'll tell you, when I make plans, I like to see them work. I planned to get Sholto and take him and your dad back to Beale, so your dad would go free. But somebody shot Sholto. My plans were spoiled. I don't like it.
My, Carol said in vicious mockery. Did someone cross our nasty little bad man?
They tried to, Dave said arrogantly. They won't get away with it. Not if you tell me something, that is. Lord knows I don't like to ask you. In the first place, you probably couldn't remember. In the second place, even if it means your dad gets out of jail, you wouldn't tell me. You'd...
Will it get him out of jail? Carol said swiftly, her anger forgotten.
Yes.
Then ask me.
Who read that note your dad sent you besides you?
I didn't even have time to read it myself, Carol said quickly. It was stolen from that table while they searched the house for you.
Who's they?
Sheriff Beale, Ernie C., and Lacey Thornton. They followed me home and came in right away. Senator Maitland and Lily and I showed them through the house. When we came back to the door here, the note Lily gave me and I'd put on the table was gone. She hesitated. How will it get him out of jail?
Because it told you that we were bringing Sholto in tonight. Whoever stole it killed Sholto.
Then it was Thornton.
If you believe that all lawmen are honest and that all lawyers are nice old men.
Carol took a moment to understand this, and then her lip curled in contempt.
That's so typical of you that...
Carol ceased speaking, for she had seen Dave cock his head, as if listening to something.
What is it?
She asked. Dave didn't answer for a long moment, then he backed away from the door.
Lots of riders, he said tonelessly.
After you?
I reckon.
Carol said slowly, viciously.
I won't hide you.
Then you better get a mop and a bucket, 'cause this'll turn into a pretty messy place.
Carol said wickedly.
Let's see how the bad man gets out of this. I'm going to tell them you're here.
I know you will,
Dave sneered. He turned and ran up the stairs, then looked around him. He could see down the upstairs hall to a glass-paned door that led out onto the gallery. He hurried down the hall, softly opened the door, and listened. Someone was knocking below. He crawled out to the railing of the gallery, and, lying on his stomach, he could see a dark tangle of men below. They were splitting up to surround the house. The knock sounded again, and the door opened, and Ernie C.'s voice came plainly.
Where's Dave Coyle, Miss McPhee?
Why, what are you talking about?
Carol asked calmly. So she hadn't given him away after all. Dave didn't know why, but he was glad she hadn't. His anger with her melted away. Ernie was saying patiently,
We found his horse out back. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, Miss McPhee. You got the lamps lit. You're out of bed. You see, it's no use making a bluff, and this time I have a warrant.
Carol said nothing. Ernie went on patiently.
The place is surrounded, so we can't get away.
Suddenly he shot at her.
Your dad's in jail for murder.
He isn't,
Carol cried. It sounded as if she were really surprised.
Yes'm, Ernie said. And Sheriff Beale thinks if we get Coyle, we'll have the man who really did the murder. Your dad will go free. Now, will you let us in?
Carol said quietly.
And you, Mr. C., you believe Coyle is guilty of the murder?
Ernie's answer was a long time in coming, and then it was spoken with an undertone of savage forbearance.
No, I don't think either of them killed this man. But I'm the sheriff's deputy, and he believes it, so I guess I gotta search the house whether you like it or not. Do you aim to let us in?
There's not much I can do to stop you,
Carol said. Dave heard the posse tramping into the house. He inched back from the railing and lay there, his mind working quickly and futilely. He couldn't let them take him. He had to be free to work at this. He stepped back into the hallway and saw the moving light of a lamp somebody was bringing up the stairs. In pure desperation, he ducked into the room at his right, walked through it to the side window, and looked out. He could see the figures of men standing out there, waiting for the posse to flush him out into their guns. Now there was the sound of someone in the next room. He could hear doors being opened, wardrobes being searched. Across the stairway, other men were searching the opposite room. It was a matter of minutes before they reached here. A slow, angry resentment burned within him, and then died. He'd have to fight his way out this time. He went swiftly to the window that opened onto the gallery and softly opened it. He crawled through it and went over the railing. 2 men were in conversation there, below under the big spreading cottonwood whose farthest feathery branches touched the gallery railing. Dave knew he couldn't shin down the pillars, or they would pick him off before he was halfway down. 15 feet was too far to jump, and he wouldn't, couldn't shoot them. And then he heard the door open in the room beyond him and knew he must act at once. He climbed up on the railing, looked out into the tangle of foliage ahead of him, drew a deep breath, and jumped out, his arms spread wide. Crashing into the thin branches, he brought his arms together, hugging everything to him. He didn't get any big branches, but he got one reasonably thick one, and as he fell then, he hugged it tighter. His drop was checking a little, and then he heard the branch snap, followed by the cracking sound of the smaller ones. Then he heard the sharp, dry rip of bark peeling off, and he fell downward and outward in a pendulum swing. But the bark was peeling off more slowly than his fall, and it was checking his fall. When he felt himself at the bottom of the arc, he let go. He sailed out into space, then landed jarringly on his side. He felt his gun slide out of its holster, heard it slide off in the leaves. Then a burst of gunfire from the ground and from the gallery opened up on him. He came to his feet looking for his gun and not finding it and knowing bitterly that he couldn't wait to search. He ran zigzag fashion toward the corrals until he was out of the light, then paused and listened. Men were shouting all around him, and he could hear them pounding down the stairs and out the door. He lay down where he was, hoping against hope that they wouldn't find his gun. Already men were running out toward the corral, passing him in the dark. They were shooting now, shooting at shadows and the night, and everything they thought might be the $7,000 that his carcass represented. Carol came to the door with a lamp. Ernie came out after her, took the lamp, and went over to the place Dave had fallen. He stooped, picked up a gun, then turned and yelled, "Get some lamps and lanterns! He lost his gun!" A half-dozen lamps and lanterns were commandeered, and then the posse spread out in a wide half-circle and started toward the corrals. Softly, cursing bitterly, Dave began to crawl toward the corrals, taking advantage of all the cover he could. They knew he was unarmed, and they'd shoot him down in a second now if they saw him. They could afford to be brave. He heard one man on the other side of the horse corral call, "I got this side covered, Ernie." Dave rolled under the bottom rail of the horse corral and then, bending over, crossed it. Beyond, two men were talking. Dave crawled over in the shadow of the big tank and considered his position. They would soon close in on him, joining up with the men on the other side of the corrals who had rushed ahead. If he ever got out of this, he'd need his luck to do it. There was just no way out. In one long, bleak moment, Dave considered this. He was going to have to surrender. He raised his hand to the edge of the trough, ready to hoist himself up and surrender. Bitterness was hard in his throat, and then his hand touched the water. The big round tank was almost full of water. A rim of ice was forming at the edges. Suddenly he paused and knew he was going to do it. He crawled over the edge of the tank and put his feet inside. The water clawed at him like hot iron, but he lowered himself in it clear to his neck. He couldn't breathe, and the cold was like an iron band around his chest, but he remembered to take off his hat and kneel on it so it wouldn't float. He hoped bitterly that nobody would notice that the water level was above the rim of the ice. He found a cleat near the bottom of the tank, and holding on to it in readiness, he looked over the rim and watched. The men with lanterns were coming closer, the first one almost at the corral. They were shouting back and forth now on both sides. Suddenly, Ernie C. stepped into the corral, and Dave heard him say, "If he ain't here, he's in the barn." Dave waited until Ernie was halfway across the corral, and then he took a deep breath and gently pulled himself under water, using the cleat to hold himself there. He tried to hold still, but he knew he was shivering. How long could he stand it? He was sure that with the light from the lantern reflected in the water, it would look only black and deep to a man investigating. Unless they looked carefully, he would be invisible under the water's surface. He tried to count, but even before he got to 10, his lungs started to ache. Then the pain and the torture came, and he held out doggedly. When he was certain that he couldn't live if he didn't get air right away, he slowly let himself up, careful again not to disturb the water. He came up, his eyes open, to find himself staring at the broad back of Ernie C., not 6 inches away from him. Ernie was sitting on the edge of the trough. With exquisite agony, Dave slowly drew in his breath. Ernie was talking to a man sitting beside him, saying, "We'll work over the barn now. Flush him into the corral here." Dave couldn't smother the chatter of his teeth. He couldn't stand the agony of this ice water another moment. Already his muscles were balled into vicious cramps that ached like a throbbing tooth. With a hand that was numb, he gently reached out for the gun in Ernie's holster. His hand was shaking, so the gun seemed to hammer on the leather of the holster as he slipped it out. When it was free, he rammed it savagely into Ernie's back, came to his feet, and wrapped a wet arm around Ernie's neck. "You there," he said to the man beside Ernie. "Throw your gun away and hurry it." The man did, and then raised his hands to the night sky. Dave shoved Ernie off the trough and clambered out. "You and me are going to walk over to a horse, Ernie," Dave said, his teeth chattering. "You better figure out how and make it quick," Ernie said thickly.
"The hell I will."
He looked around him for the others, but there was only the dim light of a lamp from behind the barn.
"Bueno," Dave said harshly. "I didn't have a gun tonight, but I got one now. Watch me."
He cocked the gun, and there was something in his manner that was deadly and final. Ernie backed off and said,
"Hold it."
"I can't much longer. I'm cold."
"Then follow me."
Ernie walked toward the corral gate. When he got there, he yelled to the man with the lantern in front of the barn.
"Go help him, Russ. I'll watch this side."
"What about the corral?"
"Mickey's here and 2 others."
The man went into the barn. Dave prodded the 2 of them out the gate, and they walked swiftly toward the house. They could hear the shouts of the men inside the barn. A horse was tied to one of the cottonwoods near the house. Dave mounted it and without a word galloped out into the valley. Dave smiled at that. He was cold, almost frozen, but he knew he was free. He knew something beyond that, too. One of 5 men, Sheriff Beale, Ernie C., Lacey Thornton, Senator Maitland, and Will Usher, was Sholto's killer and Wallace's backer. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Hardcase by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording's in the public domain. Chapter 16. The approach to the 3 rivers spread did not appeal to the aesthetics in Will Usher's nature. He was a man who liked fine things, and although that liking had got him into much trouble through the shortcuts he took to get fine things, it still didn't cure him. He didn't like 3 rivers. There were no trees, and the whole place looked as if a 4th of July picnic had just pulled off the grounds. But Will was in no position to appear critical right now. Or was he? He didn't know what attitude to take with Tate Wallace, the superior or the inferior, and he decided to let events shape his course. Before he had pulled into the yard proper, an unshaven Hardcase strolled out from the shade of the barn, where he left 2 of his companions.
"What do you want?"
the puncher asked. Will looked at him and decided he was dirty and offensive and needed taking down.
"I know one thing I don't want,"
Will said equably.
"And that's any of your lip, my man."
He ignored the man's surliness and looked at the buildings with contempt mounting in his eyes.
"Wallace around?"
"Not to you, he ain't."
"Tell him I'm the gent that tried to make him pay for Sholto," Will said. "I want to talk to him."
The calm brassiness of Will Usher impressed the puncher. He growled something and set off across the yard to the house. Will followed him and dismounted at the porch. He sat down on its edge and wiped the sweat from his hatband, then looked the place over. No, it wasn't much, he decided. If he owned the place and the money that was behind it, he'd turn this over to rats and mice and build down near the junction of the 3 rivers, off the bench. Will contemplated it for a long time and finally grew impatient. What had happened to that puncher sent to get Wallace? Will reached in his coat for a cigarette making, and his elbow bumped something. He glanced around and saw a pair of boots and, looking higher, saw a man standing there watching him. It was Wallace, all right, he knew, but he didn't know how he had got there. Will very calmly looked away, rolled a cigarette, and lighted it. Wallace said quietly,
"So you're the Ranahan that wanted 50,000 from me, are you?"
"That's right,"
Will said, looking off across the flats.
"How'd you like to get kicked as far as the drift fence you passed a couple miles back?"
Will said calmly,
"I wouldn't like it. You won't do it either."
"Oh, won't I?"
Wallace taunted. He stepped off the porch, heading for the crew by the barn. Will said softly,
"Think a minute, mister. You'll see how you can use me."
Wallace's step lagged and then paused. He turned around slowly, and now his face was curious, alert. Slowly he walked back to confront Will.
"What did you say?"
"I say you can use me. Remember, I'm the lad that helped Dave Coyle kidnap Sholto in the first place."
"That'll mean you'll get kicked 3 miles,
Wallace said.
"You're still dumb,"
Will said pleasantly.
"I know Dave."
He looked up at Wallace and said,
"You want him, don't you?"
"Dave Coyle? Hell, he don't worry me."
"He's going to."
They watched each other carefully a few seconds, and then Wallace came over and sat down beside him. Wallace looked obliquely at him, studying him a moment, then said,
How's Dave Coyle going to worry me?
He's helping McPhee. I heard him say he was, and I saw him do it.
Wallace laughed.
Nobody can help McPhee now.
Except Coyle.
How?
They were both in jail once, weren't they? They both broke out, didn't they? And Sholto, your witness, is dead.
Sure he is,
Wallace agreed.
I don't need him any more, though.
McPhee killed him.
Not McPhee.
Wallace looked at him sharply.
Who says he didn't?
I do. I didn't see it, but they told me about it in Yellow Jacket.
Did they tell you either McPhee or Coyle, both together, didn't do it?
They told me they did do it. I say they didn't, and I know.
Wallace smiled thinly, carefully.
Go on.
McPhee didn't kill him because Sholto was McPhee's only alibi. The alibi he needed to go free. Coyle didn't do it because he was Sholto's friend. Sholto let him escape from me.
Then who did kill Sholto?
Wallace asked. Will grinned. It was a flashing smile, wise and disarming.
You think I'm going to accuse you of it? Far from it, my friend. You had an alibi. So did your men. I took the trouble to learn that.
Then who did?
The man back in this outfit here.
Wallace kept the faint smile on his face. His eyes gave away nothing, not even his temper. Will didn't even bother to look at him. And for some reason that annoyed Wallace more than the accusation.
Now that's something that you own,
Wallace said dryly.
It's news to me, but how'd you figure it out?
It's pretty simple,
Will said calmly. He picked up a handful of dust and sifted it through his fingers, watching it idly. He spoke casually.
Start with Miss Carol McPhee. She sent me a letter written to Dave Coyle, but mailed it in an envelope addressed to me. She verified something that I'd suspected for a long time. That deed you have for McPhee is phony, of course.
Court ain't said so.
Exactly. You were out to sink McPhee, ruin him, grab his land and his property. The whole swindle depended on Sholto, your witness. But Sholto was kidnapped, believed murdered, and McPhee is arrested for that murder. That takes care of McPhee nicer than any lawsuit. First, it makes it seem that he's killed your witness to protect himself. Second, it hangs him and ends the lawsuit. If his daughter brings it up again, there's always the memory of her father killing your witness. No jury in the world would find for her in that case. Am I right so far?
It sounds convincing,
Wallace admitted dryly.
Good. To go on, you have McPhee in jail. Presto, he's out. And presto again, he's back with the witness and is in the clear. Almost, for on the door of the sheriff's office, Sholto was killed. McPhee and Coyle are guilty. And there's your lawsuit won again, hands down.
I did get lucky, didn't I?
Wallace murmured, watching Will.
Certainly, especially since you didn't kill him.
That's right, I didn't. So where are you?
So I'm just where it begins to get interesting,
Will murmured. He looked at Wallace now.
You're the man who stands to win $100,000 by the hanging of McPhee for the killing of Sholto. You didn't kill him, and your men didn't, but somebody did it for you.
He spread his hands.
So I'm forced to believe that you aren't alone in this business.
Wallace laughed softly.
Who's in with me if that's so?
Will shrugged.
I don't know. I don't care. All I'm interested in is helping you to keep what you gained. I'll do it for, say, $25,000.
Do what?
Get rid of Dave Coyle for you,
Will said mildly. Wallace studied his handsome face. He could see the strength in the man and the cunning, but the gall of him made him mad.
Hell, I can shoot,
Wallace said irritably.
So can he,
casually at first.
But where is he?
Wallace said wryly.
I don't know. He may be in my barn out there for all I know.
Exactly. You can't find him. And you can't kill him if you do.
But what should I want to?
Wallace asked sharply.
He can't hurt me.
He can get McPhee out of jail. He has once already, and he can again.
That makes McPhee all the more guilty.
It also earns you a slug in the back,
Will said gently, promptly. Wallace didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he said,
So you think Coyle will break McPhee out and McPhee will kill me?
He'll either kill you or he'll turn up proof of your swindle. Wallace glanced abruptly at Will, who was smiling faintly, triumphantly. Will got up then, pulled his gloves tight, and said, "Well, since you're not interested, I'll move on."
"Wait a minute," Wallace said slowly. "Come back here."
Will came back and faced him.
"Just to play safe, suppose I make the deal. You get Coyle out of the way. Can you do it?"
"Don't pay me unless I do," Will said promptly. "I'm a businessman, and I believe in cash on delivery."
"Understand," Will said flatly. "I haven't admitted anything you say is right. I'm just willing to put up the money for you to kill an outlaw."
Naturally, Will said smoothly, and he grinned his disarming smile. "I think you've needed me for a long time, Wallace."
End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Hardcase by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. It was afternoon when Ernie, with 5 of his posse, returned to the Bib Inn. The chase after Dave Coyle had been a fruitless one. Just after they had left the valley, riding hell for leather after Coyle, they had flushed a rider and chased him until 2 hours past dawn, finally cornering him in a series of wind-eroded clay dunes southwest of Wagon Mound. The stuff had bogged down his horse, and Ernie's crew had surrounded him, and the man had surrendered. He turned out to be some chuckline rider who had built up a stake in a poker game in Yellow Jacket earlier in the evening. He had run, he said, because he thought he was being held up. Ernie had been too disgusted to swear. Coyle, of course, was free as a bird, miles away. But Ernie kept remembering those wet clothes and the misery of them. Wouldn't Dave want to shuck them and get warm? And what was easier than circling back to the Bib Inn, getting a change, and going to bed? It was something that Coyle would pull, confident that he wouldn't be suspected. This thought kept nagging Ernie until he named off 5 men to ride back with him to the Bib Inn and sent the others home. Approaching the Bib Inn from the north, keeping the barns and outbuildings between them and the house, he searched the outbuildings and especially the barn loft. Afterward, he scattered his men through the stand of cottonwoods and half-heartedly approached the house. He was a little sorry for Carol McPhee, and he felt sheepish about bothering her, but duty was duty. He yanked the bell pull and waited, a stubborn-faced, tired-looking man at the fag end of his patience. The door was opened by Lily Sholto. She was pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes, and her face was so sad that Ernie felt a pity for her without knowing why he did.
"Morning," he said, grinning a little. "I'm back again. Is Miss McPhee home?" "She's gone to town to be with her father."
Ernie frowned.
"And she's left you here all alone?" "No, she's bringing the body back here, and then I'll go back to town with her, because we'll be moving out."
Ernie looked at her blankly, alarm in his eyes.
"Body? Is McPhee dead?" "The body of Jim Sholto."
"Oh," Ernie said. He was about to add, "I see," but he didn't see at all. He said, "Miss McPhee is burying him here?"
"Yes."
Is she just doing it?"
he said awkwardly and bluntly, finally.
"Why is she bringing the body here to bury it?"
Lily said softly.
"Because she's so kind, I think. Is there anything wrong with that?"
No,
Ernie said hastily. Then he said stubbornly,
"Look, did she know Sholto? I mean, why don't his kin bury him?"
"I'm his kin,"
Lily said quietly.
"I'm his wife. Didn't you know?"
Ernie looked as if he had been hit. There was anger and pity and shame in his face as he took off his hat.
I'm plumb sorry, Mrs. Sholto. No, I didn't know."
Lily didn't say anything, only waited courteously for Ernie to go. Ernie understood that she didn't want him around, that she wanted to be alone. But there was something else he could do. He said,
"Where are you burying him, ma'am?"
"Out at the edge of the cottonwoods to the south, there on that rise."
"Good day, ma'am,"
Ernie said then. He rounded up his men, and when they saw him, his eyes had turned bleak and his jaw was set. He said,
"There ought to be shovels out in the shed. We're going to dig a grave."
They worked at it for 2 hours, and Ernie never gave up his shovel. A lot of things were simmering in his mind while he worked in the hot sun. Before today, Sholto had just been a man who had the bad luck to be killed. Today it was different. He had been this girl's husband, and he had been bushwhacked. Ernie wasn't a man of many words or many thoughts, but that afternoon he pledged to himself that he'd see Sholto's murder avenged, or turn in his badge and move out of the country. They finished in late afternoon and set out for Yellow Jacket. The lot of them were tired and hungry, and Ernie the most tired of all. It was late in the evening when they arrived in town. Only the saloons were lighted, and Ernie dropped his crew off at King's Keno Parlor for a nightcap and went on to the sheriff's office. The place was dark, and after putting up his horse down street at the feed corral, Ernie let himself in with the key and went back to the cell block. McPhee's guards were playing poker, and McPhee was asleep. Ernie tramped back to his room off the corridor and let himself in. There was the smell of tobacco smoke in the room, and he supposed these guards had been in bed. He struck a match, lighted the lamp, and then turned around to throw his hat on the cot. Dave Coyle was sitting there watching him. For 2 long seconds, his hand extended with the hat in it. Ernie stared at Dave Coyle. He was so wary that it took that long to be sure that he wasn't lightheaded and just seeing things. Then Dave spoke, and he was sure he wasn't.
"I haven't got a gun. I want to talk to you."
Ernie looked down at his waist. Sure enough, he didn't have a gun in sight, but he could be sitting on one. Some inner caution told Ernie that he'd better keep his mouth shut and not yell and play this cagey. His hat fell to the floor and he licked his lips. He was afraid and ashamed of being so he said dryly, "We've been wanting to talk to you, too. Hadn't you heard?"
"You and Bill? Well, I don't want Bill. I want to talk to you, alone, private, like we are now. Don't call anyone or you'll be sorry."
"You might be sorry, too," Ernie said tonelessly. "There's bars on that window."
"I didn't mean that kind of sorry. I meant you'll be sorry afterward if you don't listen."
Ernie looked at him carefully, quizzically, his fear slowly fading. Then he shook his head.
"Man, I give up," he said softly. "Why in hell didn't you surrender last night and save us the trouble of chasing you instead of coming here and doing it?"
"I ain't surrendering," Dave said quietly. "After we talk, you'll know why."
Ernie slowly, experimentally drew his gun. Nothing happened. He pulled a chair toward him, locked the door, then sat down, his glance never leaving Dave. Ernie thought, "This is it. I wonder if I'll ever get him when it breaks." Ernie said with a confidence he didn't feel, "It better be good. Start off."
"I was lying on that gallery last night when you come to the Bib M," Dave said slowly. "I heard you say to Miss McPhee that you didn't reckon I shot Sholto."
"I don't,"
Ernie said. He was interested now.
"And you don't reckon McPhee did either?"
"No, it don't hold water. Not a drop."
"You're right," Dave said, watching him. "We didn't. I saw the shot. It come from the roof of Beatty's store."
Ernie forgot his fear now, forgot who he was talking to. He said,
"I knew it. See who it was?"
"No. If I had, I'd have killed him," Dave said quietly. "I left town with a posse on my neck. You know that."
"And you want me to work on that?" Ernie said cautiously. "Hell, man, it could be anyone in town."
"It could be 5 men," Dave said. "Just 5 men."
Ernie came up straight in his chair, suddenly alert.
"How do you figure that?"
"Remember when you and Thornton and Bill followed Carol McPhee out to the Bib M hoping to trap us?"
Ernie nodded and he went on.
"Remember she was just opening a letter when you broke in?"
Ernie scowled and shook his head.
"No."
"She was. She hadn't read it. She laid it on the table and took you around the house. After you'd gone, she looked for the letter. It was gone. Stole."
"What was in it?"
Ernie asked swiftly.
"That letter," Dave said slowly, "was from McPhee. We'd been there earlier and left it with Lily Sholto." He paused, watching Ernie. "It said that we'd bring Sholto into the sheriff's office the night after next. Last night, that was. We did. And Sholto was shot."
Ernie was listening carefully, hanging on every word. Dave raised his left hand, spread the fingers, then started ticking off each finger as he said,
"There was you, Bill, Lacey Thornton, and Maitland. 4 men. One of you killed Sholto."
Ernie said swiftly,
"You think I did. That's why you come."
"I know you didn't. That's why I'm here."
Ernie felt a sudden flush of pleasure, but his face didn't show it. He scowled and rubbed his jaw.
"Then it was a grudge killing against Sholto. It had nothing to do with the Three Rivers outfit, because Wallace has an alibi."
Dave smiled thinly.
"Whoever killed Sholto is the Three Rivers outfit."
Ernie stared at him blankly, then shook his head.
No, Wallace is 3 Rivers.
Dave, talking in a steady voice, told Ernie some things then that was like lighting a lamp in a dark room. He started out with his conversation with Carol, with the supposition that the deed was forged. Then he skipped to Wallace and told of what he knew of him. Then he explained the kidnapping of Sholto and how Wallace refused to buy Sholto back once McPhee was in jail on suspicion of Sholto's murder. Slowly, point by point, he built up the case against Wallace, finally proving that Wallace was the only one who stood to gain by Sholto's death. And then, he said, the night Sholto was killed, Wallace and his crew had an alibi. Someone unknown, the man behind 3 Rivers, was the killer. Nobody else could have been. He paused a moment, letting that sink in. Presently, Ernie said, "It holds water. It makes sense. But have you got proof?" "No, but I'll get it." "How?" Dave said quietly, arrogantly. "I'll have your killer, the man behind Wallace, in a week. I'll have him in jail for you." This was too much for Ernie. He sneered openly. "You've made brags in your life, Coyle. Some you backed up. You can't back that one up." "Not alone," Dave said quietly. "I can if you'll help me." "Me?" Ernie said blankly. "But hell, I'm a deputy supposed to be hunting you." "You're also sworn to uphold the law," Dave pointed out. "Or are you scared of me?" "I'm talking to you, ain't I?" Ernie said hotly. Dave nodded. "You are. You're talking to me without shouting, without threatening me, without bragging, and without poking a gun in my face. Maybe it's 'cause we both hate murder that you're listening. But now I'm wondering something." "What?" Ernie asked belligerently. "If you don't love a tin badge more than you hate murder." Ernie felt himself getting mad, but when he looked at Dave Coyle, at that quiet, alert face, not jeering, he paused. And slowly a feeling of shame came over him. Dave Coyle had touched him where it hurt. He told what seemed to be the truth, but it was not the truth. To prove that to himself, Ernie only had to think of Lily Sholto. He'd sell his badge for a drink if he could get Sholto's killer. He said quietly, "I'm going to prove you a liar. You'll help me, even if it means breaking the law?" Ernie's honest face was sober now. "I will. I'll do anything short of murder." "You're passing up $7,000 reward." "I ain't a bounty hunter," Ernie said grimly. "You prove to me you're more than a cheap outlaw, and I'll forget that." They didn't shake hands on it because they didn't need to. Dave's doubt of Ernie was far more binding than a mere handshake, and Ernie's skepticism of Dave was equally binding. Their pride had done that. Ernie put down his gun on the table as a token of his honesty, tilted his chair back, and said, "Since we're partners, let's have it. What do you aim to do first?" Dave leaned back against the wall, his forehead creased in a scowl. "See if I figure right, Ernie. The way I look at it, here's the way it stands. Wallace, and whoever's behind him, don't have to make another move. They're set. All they got to do is let the law take care of McPhee. That right?" Ernie nodded. "Then it's up to us to make 'em move." Ernie grunted. "How?" "Steal the forged deed." Ernie's head yanked up. His tired eyes opened wide. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he murmured, "That'll make 'em move, all right. But how—" His voice died. He was looking at Dave. Dave's head slowly turned toward the window as if he were listening. There was a faint, unnoticeable rustling of brush outside the window, and then Dave exploded. His hand had been near Ernie's hat. He picked it up, and in one fluid motion he threw it at the lamp, at the same time rolling off the cot onto the floor. The lamp winked out. He hit the floor, and on the heel of his fall came the blasting, deafening roar of a shotgun through the window, then a swift pounding of feet toward the alley. Even as the buckshot was still rolling about the room, the plaster above the bed still sifting down, Dave had come over to Ernie, who had reared out of his chair. "You heard, Ernie?" "No." "Listen, make it quick. Leave that gang in the cell block outside before they come in here. Find out which of those 4 men is in town. Meet me at the feed stable." There was the pounding of feet behind the door, and Dave dodged against the wall. Ernie yanked the door open and faced the excited guards. "Outside!" Ernie bawled. "Somebody took a greener to me. Split up and head for the alley." He led the way, pounding out of the sheriff's office. The 5 guards beat their way back between the buildings. Dave followed on their heels and then walked swiftly and unconcernedly down the street toward the darkened feed stable. Back in the alley, both groups met, and then Ernie began to swear blisteringly. It was as black as the bottom of a well, and the bushwhacker was gone.
"What happened, Ernie?" one man asked. "Happened?" Ernie raged. "Why, I was lying on the cot, too damn tired to go to bed. I heard something outside, reared up, saw something move behind them bars, threw my hat at the lamp, and ducked. Then this greener cut loose through the window." "Dave Coyle," one of the guards said bitterly. "That sounds like him." Ernie was about to protest, and then he thought he'd better start allaying suspicions right now. "It's likely," he growled. "That damn little whelp." He judged he had given Dave enough time to get out now, so after futilely beating the alley for 5 minutes, he ordered the guards back to the cell block. What few people were still up were collected in front of the jail, but he ordered them home. Beale, he thought, would be down soon, and he didn't want to listen to him anymore. He remembered what Dave had told him, so he dragged his weary bones out in the street again. At the hotel, he found that Senator Maitland was registered. He asked if Lacey Thornton was in town, and Bitterman said he wasn't here. Beale was here, of course, and so was he, the fourth man. But Ernie didn't want to pass up any chances. He started the rounds of the 3 saloons still open, idly inquiring if Lacey Thornton was upstairs anywhere. 2 of them said no. At King's Keno Parlor, the first sight that met his eyes was Wallace standing at the bar drinking with a handsome frock-coat man who wore buckskin gloves. With a new suspicion simmering inside him, Ernie walked up to the bar and said bluntly, "I'm getting an alibi from everybody in town, Wallace. Where was you when that greener went off?" Wallace grinned and looked at the barkeep.
"Where was I, Tim?"
Right here,"
Tim King said.
"Him and his friend both."
"Give me a drink," Ernie said in disgust. Wallace's companion came over to Ernie's other side. "Has it occurred to you that Dave Coyle might be the man you're looking for?" he asked pleasantly. Ernie's face showed only a wary disinterest. "Hell yes, it's occurred to me. I suppose it was." He let it ride that way, wondering who the man was, and drank his drink. When he was finished, Wallace said,
"Well, Ernie, I'm moving in on the BBM tomorrow. You might as well tell Bill."
"You are?" Ernie asked, surprise in his voice.
"I've got the legal right," Wallace said calmly. "I've waited 2 weeks longer than the deed called for. McPhee's case against me is finished, I think, since he tried to kill my witness and will hang for it. Any reason I have to wait?"
"Why, don't reckon," Ernie admitted.
"Well, I want to make it legal. Tell Bill for me. You can tell Miss McPhee, too."
"Sure." Ernie said goodnight, went back to the gambling tables and heard other alibis, and then went out, heading for the feed stable. The news from Wallace wasn't so good. He wondered what Dave would say to that. He came up the alley to the corral behind the feed barn and was walking toward the driveway when a voice said beside him,
"Well?"
It was Dave. Ernie said, "Bill's in town, Maitland's at the hotel, I'm in town, and Wallace was talking with a stranger when it happened."
"What stranger?"
"Good-looking, frock coat, yaller gloves, very fancy. Told me you likely did it." That would be Will Usher, Dave thought. So Will had thrown in with Wallace now, had he? Dave smiled faintly in the dark. Leave it to Will to smell money and rub elbows with it. Ernie said wearily, "That mean anything to you? 3 of the 4 was here?"
"I don't know,"
Dave said. "Then does this mean anything to you?" Ernie asked gloomily. "Wallace is moving into the BBM tomorrow." For a moment there was silence. Ernie heard what sounded to him like the soft, noiseless laugh of his companion. "What's funny?" he asked.
"Why, nothing," Dave said. "Only that deed is as good as stole right now. Listen."
And he began to talk, and Ernie listened long and carefully, and was dumbfounded at what he heard. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Hardcase by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Sheriff Beale came into the office next morning brisk and beaming, his cherub's face still pink from his morning shave. He found Ernie in the swivel chair, feet cocked on the desk, hands behind his head.
"Well, well," Bill said briskly. "They tell me you were shot at last night, Ernie."
"Yeah," Ernie said sourly. "It ain't any fun. Where was you?"
"In bed."
"So you don't come down to see about it unless I'm dead, huh?" Bill looked carefully at him.
"Boy, you got up on the wrong side of the bed this morning."
"Sure I did, and stepped right into a pound of buckshot and plaster," Ernie said sourly. He had made no move to get out of Beale's chair, in itself a sign of revolt. Bill sensed something and leaned on the desk.
"What's the matter with you, Ernie?"
"I'm fed up. Ernie said grimly. "I've been chasing that damn Coyle from hell to breakfast, and all I got out of it was dust in my eyes. I get laughed at and cussed at just 'cause I don't believe fairy stories about who killed Sholto. Then I get shot at." He looked at Beale. "And you ask me what's the matter. Ain't it enough?"
Beale laughed and said, "Boy, our job's done. In a week, McPhee's trial will be over, and we'll be rid of this mess."
Ernie grunted sourly. "Wallace says to tell you he's moving on to the BM today." Beale frowned a little, and Ernie went on, still sourly. "Says it's legal enough, so he's moving in."
"Well, I guess it is,"
Beale said, nodding. Beale was in a cheerful mood that nothing could destroy this morning, but Ernie was determined. He said, "I just been down to get Sholto's stuff from the coroner. Look at what I found." He pulled out a drawer. In the bottom of it were some coins, some dirty matches, a stockman's knife, a sack of tobacco, and a worn and dog-eared letter. Bill looked at them without interest and said,
"Well, give 'em to Wallace."
"I wouldn't," Ernie said slowly. Something in his voice made Bill look at him.
"Why not?"
Ernie picked up the envelope, held it in his hand, and said, "Read what's inside." Bill did. It was a note on a dirty piece of paper. It said, "I'm all right. I'll see you soon. Signed, Jim." Bill read it and said,
"He was likely going to send it to his wife before McPhee killed him."
Ernie grunted. "Don't you notice anything funny?"
Bill looked at the letter again, turned it over, studied it, then said, "Why, no."
Ernie said with seeming irrelevance, "Remember when you and me rode out to the Three Rivers to take a look at Wallace's deed that McPhee give him?"
"Of course. Why?"
"Remember Sholto's signature?"
"Sure, it was on the deed as a witness."
Ernie pulled his feet down, stretched, yawned, cuffed his hat to the back of his head, then said casually, "There was a signature on the deed, all right. It said Jim Sholto, but it wasn't that writing." Bill came to his feet. His good humor suddenly evaporated. Ernie concluded that his little job of writing the note last night and dirtying it and sleeping on it made it look convincing enough. Bill suddenly groaned softly and stared at Ernie.
"You sure?"
"You saw the deed," Ernie said. "Remember that writing of Sholto's was round and kind of shaky like he was drawing a picture. Well, this ain't like that."
"But, my God," Bill burst out, "do you realize what this means?"
"Sure I do," Ernie said. "It means Wallace has got to prove that the signature on his deed is really Sholto's."
But damn it, he's moving today. He'll fight. Why, we'll be in one hell of a mess. Twice the mess we've been in."
Bill's face was a picture of panic and dismay. He groaned again and said,
"What do we do?"
Ernie shrugged. "You got me," he said, immediately cheerful.
"Look," Bill said, "I gotta be here today when McPhee's arraigned. You go out and take a look at that deed."
"Nothing doing," Ernie said flatly. Bill's face hardened.
"You want to keep your job, Ernie?"
"Not that bad," Ernie said cheerfully. "Hell, I ain't going to start another damn war in this county. I'll quit first." He grinned at Bill. "Then where'll you be, Harv? You start getting tough with Wallace and you won't be able to hire a deputy. No man wants to commit suicide." Bill only glared at him. Ernie scratched his head and went on. "I got a way, I think. I've been studying on it, and I can't see what's wrong with it. It wouldn't make Wallace sore, and you could still find out if Sholto's signature is a phony."
"How?"
"Send a man out with word to Wallace to bring the deed with him when he moves into the BM today. Tell him it's just protection for the sheriff's office. He takes possession and you want to be sure it's legal. Tell him you want to look at it just to protect yourself."
"What if it ain't legal?"
Ernie spread his hands, palms out, and said, "Turn it over to the U.S. Commissioner's office and let them sweat." Bill thought a moment and said,
"Yeah, I'll be all right. We can look at it without making him suspicious."
"Sure."
"I'll send a man,"
Bill said. The office door opened just then, and a mild-looking townsman walked in. After the greetings, he said, "Harv, someone busted in the office last night." Bill frowned.
"What would anybody want in the county recorder's office? Is anything missing?"
"Not that I can find. Books is all in order. Stamps are all there. But still the lock was busted."
Bill said to Ernie, "Go over and take a look, Ernie." Ernie hoisted himself to his feet and followed the man out.
The county of Yellow Jacket did not have a courthouse. Its business offices were in the front of the second story of Beatty's store. The courtroom was in the rear. Both were approached by a wooden stairs on the outside of the store. Ernie followed the county clerk up to the top of the steps, investigated the lock, and scratched his head.
Well, it's busted all right, but since nothing's gone, what's the difference?
The clerk laughed. I guess there isn't any.
I'll get a new lock,
Ernie said. He went down the stairs, and this time there was a smile on his face. Dave had made a neat enough job of breaking in, and he hadn't left a trace of what he was after. Considering that Sheriff Beale had also fallen for the deed fraud and had ordered Wallace to have the deed at the Bib Inn that afternoon, Ernie concluded that he and Dave made a good pair. But he wished, almost wistfully, that his conscience didn't hurt them the little it did. But when he remembered last night, the deafening blast from the shotgun, his conscience evaporated. The only thing left was speculation as to who shot through the window. Beale, Maitland, Lacey Thornton, or somebody Wallace sent. He didn't know, and he wished savagely that he did, for whoever it was knew that he had been talking with Dave. When Dave saw the first pennant of smoke rise from the chimney of the Bib Inn after dawn, he waited long enough to give Lily Sholto time to dress and then knocked at the kitchen door. Lily answered him and let him in. She even smiled a little as she shut the door behind her. Dave said quietly, "It was pretty lonely last night, wasn't it?"
I've got over it, Dave, Lily said. I thought all last night about it, and I know something now. Jim was lucky to be killed.
Dave didn't say anything, and Lily went on.
I suppose you guessed that Wallace had something on Jim.
I figured he did.
Well, it was murder, Lily said. Plain, inexcusable murder. Jim killed a man once, a good man, when he was mad. Wallace saw him do it. He held that over Jim for 3 years and brought Jim here from Texas when he came. Every waking hour of Jim's life he thought of that murder. It was never away from him. It rode him and sucked the very life out of him. I tried to help him, but I couldn't.
She shrugged.
Don't you think he's better off now?
Dave nodded again, admiring this girl's sense. Lily shuddered a little, as if shaking off the memory.
And that's why I'm not very sad about it. I'll miss him, but he's through with all that. Through with it.
She smiled again and said,
You'll want breakfast?
I could use some, Dave said. I'm going to look through the house.
He disappeared in the front part of the house, and Lily set about getting breakfast. She liked Dave Coyle. Carol McPhee could hate him and like him by turns, but there was none of that uncertainty in Lily. For Dave Coyle, outlaw or no outlaw, was the only man she could remember who had tried to help Jim, to be a friend to him. It was Dave Coyle who had taken her from Wallace's place, where every drunken puncher annoyed her, where Wallace taunted her daily, where her life had been lived in constant fear that Wallace, when he couldn't use Sholto, would toss him to the wolves without a quiver of conscience. He had tried to help them. That alone was a passport to Lily's liking. When breakfast was ready, Dave appeared and sat down. He said,
Ernie said the funeral's today.
Lily nodded, a look of puzzlement in her face.
Isn't Ernie C. the deputy sheriff?
Dave grinned faintly.
Why am I talking with him? Well, there's going to be a lot of things you won't understand, Lily. But don't wonder out loud. You'll know soon.
Are you going to get the man that killed Jim?
Dave's gray eyes looked steadily at her.
I am,
he said.
Then don't worry about me, Lily said. I won't ask questions.
Dave pointed to the door to the front part of the house.
When I walk through that door, he said, you forget I've been here. Don't think about me. Don't look for me. Do everything like you usually do. Wallace is moving in today. Miss McPhee will tell you when she comes out. I reckon you'll move some furniture and such. Don't act nervous and don't look for me. Forget me.
Then you'll be in the house?
Dave nodded and went on eating. Presently, Lily said quietly,
Dave?
He looked up.
When this is over, what are you going to do?
Dave looked puzzled.
What I always did, I reckon. Just knock around.
And leave Carol here?
Dave looked blank.
Where would I take her?
Where does any man take his wife?
Dave stared at her a long moment, and then he felt his neck begin to get hot, his face too. He looked down at his plate and shook his head.
I'm an outlaw, Lily. It can't happen.
Jim was a murderer, Lily said. It can happen.
She wouldn't have me.
She cried the other night when she thought they were going to get you.
She was crying over Jim's being shot, I reckon.
Not all of it, Dave. She was crying like her heart was going to break.
Dave said miserably.
Quit it, Lily. Quit it.
All right, Lily said wisely. But just remember it.
Dave got up, his face bleak, and went into the front of the house. There was a noise somewhere up there, and then it was silent. Lily finished her work, then went through the rooms. She was looking for him like she was told she mustn't, and he was gone, vanished, and yet she knew he was there somewhere. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Hardcase by Luke Short. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Just at dusk, Ernie, Beale, and Senator Maitland had helped Lily and Carol load the next to the last trunk into the buckboard. It was then that Lily said,
"There's someone coming into the valley."
Ernie looked. A canvas-covered spring wagon had just topped the ridge with flanking riders on each side. It was Wallace, all right, moving in. A dozen more riders trailed out behind the wagon. Ernie looked at Carol, and Carol said,
"If you'll bring that last bag, please, we'll go."
Senator Maitland got it from the front door. Bill helped Lily and Carol into the seat, and Ernie loaded the bag while Maitland climbed in and took the reins. Carol handed Maitland something, and Maitland gave it to Beale.
"The key," he said dryly. "Miss McPhee has given him everything else. He might as well have that."
Bill flushed a little under the jibe and said,
"All you gotta do is give the word, Miss McPhee, and I'll make Wallace wait until the furniture's moved out."
"Where would I move it?"
Carol said dully.
"No, he might as well have everything, lock, stock, and barrel."
"I'll see he takes good care of it,"
Beale said.
"Why shouldn't he? It's his, isn't it?"
Maitland said grimly. He slapped the reins down on the horses, and the buckboard moved off. Bill came back to the porch and sat on its edge with Ernie. Bill watched the two wagons pass in the middle of the valley, neither Wallace nor Carol giving any sign of recognition. Afterward, he drew out his bandana and wiped his face with it. Ernie looked sleepily at him and said,
"Cheer up, Harv. It ain't no worse than a toothache."
Bill swore.
"What if he won't show it?"
"Tell him you'll kick him off then. You act tough if he does, act plumb pretty if he does."
Bill said frantically,
"Let me look at that letter of Sholto's again."
Ernie handed it to him, and Bill studied it as if he was trying to memorize it. Then he handed it back, and they got up to meet Wallace and his crew. A sour-faced cook was in the wagon, Marty Cord driving it. Wallace and Will Usher were riding on either side, and the rest of the Three Rivers crew was strung out in the rear. Bill came out to the tie rail, Ernie loafing behind him. Marty Cord was going to drive the wagon around in the rear, but Wallace stopped him. Wallace was clean-shaven today, wearing a black suit, and his boots were polished. Ernie studied him covertly, trying to get a hint of his temper. Wallace swung down, grinned, and said,
"Didn't have any trouble moving them out, did you, Sheriff?"
Beale saw that Wallace was agreeable, and he breathed a deep sigh of relief. This didn't look as if there was going to be any argument.
"No trouble. They left a house full of furniture for you."
He cleared his throat and said confidently,
"All you gotta do to take possession is give me a look at that deed."
"Yeah," Wallace said carelessly.
"I got your message. Seems kind of queer, but then you're welcome to look at it again." "I'm playing it safe," Bill said with what he hoped was a grim tone. "I don't want McPhee claiming I took your word for the deed. I want to see it." Sure. Hand down that iron box, Marty."
Marty Cord reached into the load and lifted down a heavy metal box. Wallace put it on the ground, separated a key from the others he carried in his pocket on the end of a chain, then knelt and unlocked the box. Will Usher watched him with apparent indifference as he handed Beale the deed. Beale unfolded it, and Ernie came over and looked over his shoulder. Beale read the deed, turned it over, and looked at the signatures. Ernie said suddenly,
"That's funny."
"What is?"
Wallace asked, suspicion in his voice. Bill rammed his elbow in Ernie's stomach, but Ernie went on blandly.
"I seen Sholto's writing once. It didn't look like that."
Bill turned on him, his eyes imploring, but Ernie didn't even look at him. He watched Wallace, whose face had settled into hard, deep lines. He kept his hot gaze on Ernie and said,
"You saying Sholto's signature is a forgery?"
"I'm telling you what I saw,"
Ernie said easily. Bill was too scared to say anything. Wallace suddenly turned and said,
"Marty, reach in the barrel where the dishes are. There's a pack of letters on top."
He turned to Ernie.
Lily Sholto quit my place so sudden she didn't take her stuff with her. Mrs. Babson sent those letters along."
Marty handed Ernie down a package of letters.
"These are from Jim Sholto to his wife," he said meagerly. "Look at the signature."
Beale untied the package, took a letter out, turned it over, and compared its signature with the one on the deed. They matched absolutely. He said viciously to Ernie,
"Take a look, hardhead."
Ernie did. Then he said innocently,
"Why, sure, they're the same."
"Satisfied, Sheriff?"
Wallace asked dryly.
"I always was," Bill said bitterly. "It's him that wasn't."
"Oh, I'm satisfied," Ernie said. "Much obliged."
"And I can move in?"
Wallace asked Beale.
"Go ahead, the place is yours. Come on, Ernie."
He and Ernie walked over to their horses. Ernie suddenly stopped, snapped his fingers, and said,
"Oh, I forgot my shell belt."
He had taken it off and draped it over a chair back when they were helping load trunks. Whistling, he went back into the house. They heard his whistle fading, then growing stronger. He came out again, strapping on his shell belt. He and Beale got on their horses, waved to the crew, and rode out. As soon as they were out of earshot, Beale said bitterly,
"What you got to say for yourself?"
"Nothing,"
Ernie said blandly.
"What if those signatures hadn't matched?" Beale said, anger in his voice. "We'd have gotten one hell of an argument."
"That's a fact,"
Ernie agreed.
"They did, though. I can't figure it out."
Beale looked at him a long time, and then he shook his head.
"Sometimes I don't know," he murmured glumly. "Sometimes I think I'll put a gun in my mouth and pull the trigger. It's a hell of a lot quicker than letting a dumb deputy do it, and it ain't half to worry."
Outwardly, Ernie looked injured and remained silent. Inwardly, he was laughing. He had given Sheriff Beale one of the most uncomfortable 10 minutes of his life. That was just for fun. The other wasn't. Because that deed was at the Bib Inn now, and somewhere inside the house, Dave Coyle said he would be hidden. Ernie didn't know for sure, but he was willing to bet that Dave was in there. When Beale and Ernie had ridden away, Wallace picked the box up, instructed a rider to drive the wagon around to the rear, told Marty Cord and Usher to follow him, and they went into the house. The cook walked straight through to the kitchen, but the others paused at the door of the living room and looked around them. Wallace, whose idea of elegance was a saloon with a tile floor, looked at the rugs, the furniture, the piano from St. Louis, the heavy pink glass lamps, and the curtains. He whistled in awe, and then made a wry face. Marty Cord wasn't impressed. Will Usher was, although his face didn't show it. The three of them looked at all the downstairs rooms, then went upstairs to the bedrooms. When they came to Carol's room, Wallace stepped on the threshold and goggled. There was a fluffy counterpane on the bed. The white curtains were starched stiffly, and there was a lingering scent of lavender in the room.
"Well, well,"
Wallace drawled. He walked over to the bed, picked up the counterpane, looked at it, then ripped it in half and dropped it on the floor. Next, he went to the ornate marble-topped dresser. He raised the iron box and crashed it down on the marble, cracking it. Then he threw the box into the big mirror above the dresser. Methodically, he went around the room, yanking down the pictures and putting his foot through them. Then he looked up at Will and Marty grinned.
"Get this muck out of here," Wallace said. "It looks like a honky-tonk."
"I wish it was,"
Marty said. He grinned slyly.
"You got all the fixings, boss. Why don't we move some gals out here?"
Wallace laughed.
"You like the smell so good, Marty. You can have the place. Me, I'll take something without the perfume. Tell the boys to take over."
He looked again at the room.
"Anything they don't like they can throw out the window."
He caught Will Usher looking at him with something like dismay in his face. Wallace grinned wolfishly.
"You don't like it, dude?"
Will caught himself in time.
"I was just wondering,"
Will drawled, grinning,
"how we get that bed out the window."
Wallace laughed again. This was his hour, and he was in a rare good mood. The Bib Inn was his, and he set about immediately to pull it down to the level of a cheap hotel lobby. He took McPhee's room for himself, the room on a rear corner. It was small, barren of rugs, and a rickety old bed, a heavy dresser, and a chair made up the furniture. He sent Will and Marty up to look over the attic and search the rest of the house, and then he remembered he still carried the iron box. Suddenly aware that it was heavy, he walked over to the dresser and grabbed the handle of a drawer and pulled. It didn't budge. He set the box on top and tried both hands. Still the drawer wouldn't budge. He kicked it savagely, strode out into the hall, and bawled, "Get that chest up here!" There was no answer. Marty and Will were on the roof. Swearing, Wallace picked up the box and went downstairs. The attic, which Marty and Will had searched, was small and empty. A short ladder rose to the trap door in the roof. Will went up, lifted the door, looked at the roof, then stepped down. Marty was watching him, chewing deliberately and delicately on a cud of tobacco. When Will stepped down off the ladder, Marty said,
I ain't had a chance to talk with you alone since you joined up. That's right,
Will said, wondering what was coming. He didn't like the tough set to Marty's jaw.
What are you doing here?
Marty asked. Will said blandly,
Didn't Tate tell you? So it's Tate now,
Marty mocked.
No, he didn't tell me. You better ask him. I'm asking you,
Marty said slowly, quiet menace in his voice.
I pay off this crew, and so far I ain't had any instructions to pay you off. You look like a joker to me, mister.
Will smiled contemptuously and hooked his thumbs in his belt.
Cord,
he drawled out.
You're dirty and you're dumb. Maybe Wallace hired me so he'd have someone to talk to besides an ape like you.
Marty flushed and straightened up.
Did he hire you, though?
Will grinned faintly.
I told you to ask him. Or are you afraid you'll get your teeth kicked down your throat?
He paused, amusement in his eyes as he watched Marty. Then he said,
Before you decide to put a slug in my back, though, you better make sure what it'll get you.
Marty spat without turning his head. The tobacco plopped on Will's boots, but he pretended not to notice it.
Just remember one thing, Marty drawled. I'm rodding this spread. Both spreads. Tomorrow I aim to have Wallace tell you that. Afraid of your job?
Will taunted.
No, but I reckon you better be afraid of it,
Marty said. He turned and went down to the second floor. It was a warning and plain enough, and Will smiled faintly at Marty's back. It was apparent that he wasn't liked here, only tolerated because Wallace had passed out the word. That was all he wanted, all he needed. Before the cook called supper, the house was overrun with the crew. At first they approached it gingerly, but after supper a poker game started in the living room. Soon there were cigarette butts burning the rugs. Someone had tipped his chair back into a glass-covered bookcase. A vase served as a spittoon, but soon it was abandoned altogether. Bedrolls were thrown down on the bedroom floor. Riders rested on the beds with their spurs on. Rifles were stacked on the hall hat rack, and there was a familiar smell of unwashed bodies, horse, leather, whiskey, and tobacco smoke. Wallace took over the dining room for his office, and Bib M had changed hands. Along toward midnight, the crew broke up, and some of the riders drifted off to bed. The droning voices of the two men on watch-out by the front tie rail were interrupted by the curses of the men playing poker. Wallace still held a hand in the game, and Will Usher was playing too. The upper story had settled into quiet. It was then that the heavy dresser in Wallace's room moved out from the wall, and Dave crawled stiffly from where he had been hiding all day. The noise Lily Sholto had heard that morning had been Dave carefully kicking out the bottoms of the dresser drawers and the back of the dresser. One stick, nailed to the back of the front panel of all the drawers, ensured their being kept closed. Its weight and size ensured against it being moved. And in that space Dave had waited, listening, trying to pick up something of what was happening since morning. He stretched, flexing his muscles, and then went to the open door and looked out into the hall. All the other doors were closed so the crew could sleep. Softly then, Dave started down the stairs, wondering if Ernie had failed him. The stairs were carpeted, and he made no noise. The card game went on, with desultory talk interrupting the silence. Dave listened until he distinguished Will Usher's voice and Tate Wallace's. Afterward, he moved softly down the dark hall to the door that led on to the kitchen. The door was shut. Dave opened it, then softly struck a match and looked down the hall. The game was going on without interruption. Then Dave set about his business. When the door was closed, there was a space on the jamb to which the hinges were fastened that was hidden. When it was opened, this space was suddenly revealed, as when a book is opened. And in this space, just below the hinge, was firmly written in pencil in Ernie's handwriting, "It's in a locked iron box, 6 by 9. Will." Dave blew out the match and pondered. An iron box, 6 inches by 9 inches, contained the deed. That box could be anywhere, buried or hidden, but it was Dave's guess that it was not. He had heard Wallace come into the room where he was hidden, try the dresser drawer, then bawl, "Get that chest up here." It seemed reasonable enough that the iron box was in the chest. Anyway, he was sure of one thing. 2 men, directed by Wallace, had delivered something heavy into Wallace's room that evening. Wallace had ordered them out, then had deposited something in the chest. Dave softly made his way back to the stairs. Still, from the door into the living room, the talk of the card players drifted out. He went back into Wallace's room, closed the door softly, and struck a match. There was Wallace's saddle thrown on the floor against the wall, and beside it a stout chest. The match died, and Dave struck another and went over to look at the chest. It was made of oak, iron-bound, and its lock was a heavy padlock. Dave's heart sank as he saw it. When the match died, he tried to lift one end of the chest. He could move it, but it was heavy. He sat down on it and thought a moment. If he got the chest to the window and dropped it, the noise it would make would wake the dead. Even then, the chest wouldn't break and open. That was out. He couldn't burn it because it would take half the night and he would be discovered. That was out too. There was only one thing left, and that was to shoot the padlock off. That would bring the whole swarm of them down on his neck. Wallace's crew, Ernie had said, numbered over a dozen. They would cut him to doll rags before he got to the stairs. For the stairs were the only way out. For if he went out the window, he would leave unfinished a little piece of business that he was determined to carry out. A piece of business that, if it went right, would straighten accounts with Will Usher for good and all. For a long moment he sat there in the dark, his face bleak and bitter. For the first time in his life he took into account the possibility of being killed. He wasn't afraid, he just wanted to live to see this thing settled. And then the bitterness passed, and he knew what he was going to do. His chances would improve a dozenfold if he could keep some of Wallace's men out of the fight, and he thought he could. Remembering Wallace's saddle thrown on the floor, he knelt down and fumbled around. Yes, there was his rope. Dave untied it and took it with him to the door again and glanced out into the hallway. Everything was quiet. A raw snore from one of the rooms across the hall melted in with the slow talk from the card game below. Dave went into the hall and passed the closed door across the way from Wallace's room. The other two bedroom doors faced each other across the hall. Dave looked at them and noticed that they were swung in. The remaining door was the half-glassed one that opened onto the galley. It swung into the hall, he noticed. That was a weakness, but he'd have to count on the sleepy thickness of these men and their unfamiliarity with the house. He bolted the gallery door, making a wry face as he did so. All they would have to do would be to climb out of their bedroom windows onto the gallery, break the glass, reach in and unbolt the door, and be on top of him. But he had to take the chance. Next, he took the rope and ran it through the grip on the thumb latch of one bedroom window, then threaded it through the grip on the opposite door. He pulled the rope tight, stretching it across the corridor. Each would be pulling against the other when he tried to open the door. It was a far more effective lock than a bar and bolt. He came back down the hall then and put his ear to the remaining door. The snores were coming from there, a pair of them. He hoped gloomily that there were only two men there. Afterward, he went back into Wallace's room, lighted the lamp and set it on the floor beside the chest, and drew out one gun. The other was wedged in his Levi waistband above his shell belt. For a moment he just stared at the chest, gauging his chances. He would have to shoot twice. One shot would take care of the outside lock. The second shot would have to be spent on blowing open the small iron chest, for he wouldn't be free to lug that around with him on this night. A second doubt assailed him. He wasn't even sure the iron box was in there. He was trying the impossible. His glance raised to the dresser, and along the face of it was the scar of Wallace's spur where he had kicked it. To Dave, that scar was a symbol. It stood for everything that Wallace believed in. Violence and destruction and respect for nothing. And beyond that, it was a symbol of what Wallace and his crew were doing to Carol and her father. Dave looked down again at the lock. Then coolly, calmly, he raised his gun and shot at the lock. The big padlock spread but did not break. Dave shot again, and this time the lock skittered off across the floor. Quietly, swiftly, he raised the lid. A litter of papers confronted him, and he threw them aside. Then on the bottom he saw the iron box and lifted it out. He tried not to listen to the other noises from the rooms beyond. He put his gun barrel to the small padlock, and one shot blew it clear across the room. Opening the lid, he saw the deed there. One long piece of paper resting inside the box like a jewel in velvet. Inside it was the receipt. Dave blew the light, folded the papers, buttoned these in his shirt pocket, then came to his feet and moved swiftly toward the door and opened it a crack. There was turmoil in the two end rooms, but Dave ignored them. It was the room opposite this that he was watching. The door suddenly pulled open, and a tousle-headed, barefoot puncher holding his pants up with one hand, a gun in the other, ran out. He leaped for the stairhead and ran down, shouting, "Who the hell shot?" Dave let him pass. He had counted two in that room. Then suddenly, from the open doorway, Marty Cord, with only one boot on, a gun in his hand, lunged for the stairs. Dave swung the door open, reached out, and wound his arm around Cord's neck, slamming the gun out of his hand with a vicious kick of his boot. There was turmoil below now, and Dave shoved Cord ahead of him down the stairs, keeping the stranglehold on him. Cord clawed futilely at Dave's arm around his throat, but he was helpless. Dave rounded the turn in the stairs, took 3 steps down, and then stopped just as Usher bawled, "Look out!" Wallace, 3 punchers, Will Usher, and the barefoot man, all standing in the hall below, swiveled their heads and looked at the stairs. For one utterly silent moment, save for the pounding on the bedroom doors above, nobody moved, nobody spoke. And then Dave said jeeringly, "Well, I reckon it's time to tell Wallace a few things, don't you?" Will, standing just ahead of Wallace, didn't answer. Wallace had a gun in his hand. He stared at Dave, and with his thumb he cocked his 6-gun. "Wallace, me and Will aimed to steal your deed. I got it in my shirt now. I also broke into the county clerk's office and got the record of it, so you ain't even got a claim to the bib-im." He had relaxed his grip on Marty's throat now, and Marty was silent. "There's just one thing I want you to know, Wallace, before I walk out of here behind your ramrod. That is, that Will was double-crossing you all along." "You're a liar!" Will Usher shouted. He started to turn around to face Wallace, but Wallace was faster. He swung his gun into Will Usher's back, and his face was white with rage. "You want proof, Wallace?" Dave jeered. "I've been hiding in the house all day. Go look below the top hinge on that door that goes into the kitchen, and you'll see what Will wrote there for me to see while he kept you playing cards." Nobody moved. There was a pounding on the doors up above, and Dave heard a muted shout. Marty gasped out, "He's a crook, Tate. Usher is." "Prince, go look," Wallace said thickly. "Drop your gun first," Dave said swiftly. The tousle-headed puncher dropped his gun, went down the corridor, opened the door, peered into the darkness, fumbled a match out, struck it, and then read aloud. Wallace could hear.
"It's in a locked iron box, 6x9. It's signed Will."
He came back down the corridor, and then Usher found his voice.
"Damn you, Dave, you lie. I'd never—"
A muffled shot sounded in the hall. Will Usher's back arched. A surprised expression crossed his handsome face. He tried to scream, took a step forward, fought to raise his gun to shoot Dave, and then every muscle in him collapsed. He fell on his face, his gun kiting across the rug and hitting the bottom step. Dave said, "Line up against the south wall and make it quick. I'm going out of here." On the heel of his speech, he heard glass shatter up above, and he knew that he would have to move fast. The crew had discovered the gallery door. He took a step down the stairs, and then Wallace dodged into the living room. His gun poked around the corner, and Marty Cord, seeing it leveled at him, yelled, "Don't shoot, Tate, don't!" Crash! Dave felt Marty Cord's body jar as if it had been hit with a sledge. For one instant, as Marty's muscles tautened to the breaking point, Dave couldn't believe it. Wallace had shot Cord, his own man, to get at him. And then Marty sagged. Dave shoved him, vaulted the rail, fell to 6 feet to the floor, and lunged for the door into the kitchen just as Wallace bawled, "After him!" A shot slapped into the door frame, and then Dave was in pitch dark. He lunged for the kitchen door, yanked, but the door didn't give. It was locked. Another shot came down the corridor and slapped into the door ahead of him. He ducked, turned left, and raced for the end of the dark kitchen. A man pounded into the kitchen from the corridor, and Dave snapped a shot at him. The man tripped and sprawled, and then Dave, remembering from breakfast, lunged through the door from the kitchen into the dining room. It was dark in here, and he flattened against the wall, peering about him in the darkness. He made out a window and ran for it. Halfway there, he heard a door slam open, and a shaft of light from the corridor was laid swiftly across the floor. Dave fell and lined his gun at the man in the door and shot. The man, still holding the door handle, fell backward, pulling the door shut. Dave picked up a chair and threw it through the window, and then 3 separate shots slammed through the window from outside and bedded in the far wall. They had the place surrounded. Dave ran for the corridor door, then yanked it open, took aim, and shot out the lamp on the corridor table. Now the lower story was half dark, and he stood back against the wall by the open door. Men were still pounding down the stairs, and he could hear them shouting outside. Above the racket was the voice of Wallace in the kitchen. "Try the office!" Dave stepped out into the dark corridor. Yes, there was one light left, and that was in the living room. He ran for it, saw a man at the open window facing outside, and then he shot the lamp out. Now the whole lower story was dark. Dave stood there at the foot of the stairs listening, beating his mind for some way out of this. He tiptoed to the front door and opened it. A squeak of the hinge gave it away, and a slug boomed into it the next second. Dave drew back and slowly loaded his guns, listening to the sounds. Someone was moving in the kitchen. A man tripped over the chair in the office. Above, the house was quiet. The man in the living room suddenly kicked the window out and leaped through, and Dave could hear him pounding for the cottonwoods, yelling, "Don't shoot!" A man in the back bawled, "Come give me a lift back here." And then it was quiet. Men were moving softly outside and in, hoping to avoid drawing fire. Suddenly a man whispered loudly,
"Steve!"
No answer.
"Steve, where are you?"
Dave whispered too.
"Here. Who is it?"
"Juke, where are you?"
"Here. Listen, he's went upstairs,"
Dave said hoarsely.
"Why'd you cut down on him?" "I come off without a gun,"
Dave whispered savagely.
"You got one?"
There was a movement ahead of him in the dark, and Dave held his breath. Then the man said,
"Here."
Dave reached out and touched a man's shoulder. Quick as thought, he ducked around behind him and rammed his gun in the man's back.
"Don't move. Don't yell."
He felt the man shaking, and then the rider whispered.
"Don't shoot Coyle,"
Dave said softly.
"Open that front door and bawl out as loud as you can. Yell, 'Wallace, we got him. He's hanging out that south window.' You savvy that? Yell it."
He shoved the man toward the door and yanked it open. A shot hammered out, and a slug whistled over their heads. Dave jammed his gun hard against the puncher's spine, and suddenly the puncher cut loose with a bawl that could be heard for a mile.
"We got him, Wallace! He's hanging out the south window! We got him!"
Dave kicked the man out into the night as a babble of voices from all sides of the house welled up. He turned and ran down under the gallery toward the north in the corral. He had almost achieved the corner of the house when he heard someone pounding toward him in the darkness. He tried to swerve out of the way, but he was too late. He rammed into the man with a force that sent them both sprawling and drove the wind from his lungs. And while he was lying there gagging, he heard Juke's voice lift up in a wild, cursing yell.
"He's got away! He ain't dead! He's heading for the corral!"
Still fighting for breath, Dave heard in the gloom the puncher he had collided with moaning softly and stirring. Dave crawled over to him, raised his gun, and crashed it down on the man's head. It was too late to move now, for a half-dozen men were running under the gallery toward him. Dave put his face to the ground and sprawled out and lay there in the darkness, trusting to the night in their haste to miss him. They were running blindly now. The first man hurdled the two figures lying side by side on the ground, and the others split their ranks and pounded past. And then he heard Wallace approaching, cursing like a maniac. Wallace paused beside him, put his hands to his mouth, and yelled,
"He ain't got a horse! Surround the barn!"
And then Wallace ran forward again, so close this time that the toe of his boot touched Dave's gun. Dave lay immobile a moment, then came to his knees. He faded into the shadow of the house, moved on past it into the cottonwoods, and then turned and ran. Within a few hundred yards, he was brought up abruptly by a dry ditch. He dived into it, squatted down, and waited there, sucking great drags of breath into his lungs, hearing the ruckus over by the corrals. He knew he would have to hurry now, for there wasn't much time. He turned west then, heading for the horse pasture at a dog trot. He skirted the stand of cottonwoods, and when he finally reached the fence, he climbed it and walked in the darkness toward the middle of the pasture. He lay down there in the grass, and presently he heard a horse pounding across the small field, searching for the loose horses. The man found them bunched down toward the far end of the field where the grass was better. Now the herd started toward the corral. Dave saw someone had lighted a lantern and hung it over the corral. Wallace was smart. He knew, or guessed, that Dave didn't have a horse. Once his men were mounted, he could beat the country inch by inch and sooner or later pick up a man afoot. The herd pounded toward Dave, and he laid down again, watching the rider ride by him, hazing the horses into the open corral gates. 2 men were by the gate, holding it open, and 2 more were guiding the horses into the corral. Dave, clinging to the fence now and crawling up on hands and knees, moved toward the corral. When the last of the horses was inside, the gate shut and 2 more lanterns lighted to help in snaking out the mounts. Dave moved closer. He kept watching the man on the horse, holding his breath. The gate shut. The rider swung off, tied his horse, took off his rope from the saddle, swung over the gate bars, and dropped into the corral. Men were cursing now as the horses milled nervously. It was slow work, cutting out horses, and these men were in a panic of a hurry. Wallace's voice goaded them with orders. Dave, on his belly now, crawled along the ground next to the corral toward the lone horse. The milling horses inside cut off the light of the lantern so that he was in darkness. He inched forward until he came to the gate. That was open, barred, and he would have to wait until the horses circled again. He lay there, peering into the dusty corral, watching the horses. A puncher made a cast, got his loop on his pony, then the horses broke and started milling. When they came around to him, Dave, keeping them between himself and the lantern, raced across the length of the gate and dived in the shadow of the poles, right at the horse's feet. The pony snorted, but nobody paid any attention. Dave reached up, untied the reins, and slowly led the horse along the corral poles until they were outside the lantern light. Then he rose and walked the horse farther back into the darkness. When he was certain he was clear, he mounted him and rode out toward the end of the pasture. There was a gate there which he went through, and then he pointed off toward the Corazon. Isolated shouts drifted down the cold night to him from the house, and he could still see the lanterns. He put a hand to his shirt pocket, felt the deed and receipt there, and then lifted his horse into an easy lope. He was smiling a little into the night, and he did not take his hand from the deed. Here, over his heart, in the palm of his hand, he held the key to the man behind Wallace, the man who killed Sholto, the man who ruined McPhee. End of chapter 19.